It's our great good pleasure to welcome back Rabbi Michael Feshbach from Temple Shalom in Chandler Chase, Maryland. He preached with us last year as our guest preacher today. Rabbi Michael.
We've got the same book like this. My friends, this is our third time here with you and the second time that you've asked me to share thoughts with you. So you're brave and I'm grateful. A special thank you to Father Tom, who also has spoken from our pulpit at the Temple Shalom, and to the incomparable Catherine. I'm getting a signal to straighten my colleagues. Catherine has become, in some ways, in many ways, my right hand and my staff. The thing about a staff is it lets you reach out further than you ever thought you could with just your arm alone. And so I'm very grateful to be here in her native setting, as it were. And thank you. I thought we might turn to a song that spoke about the rising waters. I am grateful to hear that no one apparently, no one was hurt, and at moments like this we remember a connection with something larger than ourselves. The wonderful thing about water views is their beauty, but we're reminded in the midst of flooding of the precariousness of life as well. I don't know how it is for priests and ministers' families, for PKs, as they're called, their children. In the rabbinic world, we borrow the term from PK, preachers' kids, to call them RKs, rabbis' kids. One of the members of my family was out quite late last night, and this morning we saw on our table the new Harry Potter book, so we know where he was. My kids don't love it when I use them as examples, as templates, or tell stories about them. We do it anyway. In this way, it is similar to any artist, any writer who uses their own lives as a way of reflecting and connecting to all of life. It is part of what we do. It's not fair to our families, but it's just what we do. But in some ways, they don't know how easy they have it. Those poor, misunderstood prophets. Catherine opened the reading earlier today with a selection from the book of Hosea. Kinar Yisrael v'ohavenu u'mimitzrayim karati livni קראו להם כן הלכו מפניהם לבעלים יזבחהו, from Hosea 11. Hosea. This passage speaks about how God fell in love with Israel, called to Israel, and Israel nevertheless turned away. But remember the beginning of the book of Hosea, where we first hear the biographical detail of the way in which Hosea is told to use his own life as an example. He is told, in fact, to marry. This is an R-rated sermon today. Sunday school is meeting in a different place. There isn't Sunday school in the summer. And I saw the reading from the New Testament had some words in it, so I'm going to go right ahead. Hosea, as many of you know, I assume, was instructed by God to marry a prostitute. The prostitute would then be unfaithful to him. And he would be very angry and hurt and upset and would, in love, take her back. this becomes an amazing metaphor for the relationship between God and the Jewish people, comparing a marriage to the theological setting of our fidelity, infidelity, and return in forgiveness and love. What a great metaphor. What a powerful metaphor. Here's the thing, though. A little hard to discuss this in a church on a Sunday from a pulpit. I'm not sure how to tell you this. There are kids here over their ears. A bit of history, what Catherine tells me you would call exegesis. It wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't a metaphor. When the Israelites came into Canaan, they encountered a civilization there that had its own customs and its own ways. And what was Canaanite religious worship like? Any of you know anything about voodoo? Knows that it is a practice that involves sympathetic magic. Sympathetic magic is when you take a physical representation of something that is beyond, in the metaphysical world, you manipulate it, or in some cases people have been trying to do this at both of the political conventions recently, make caricatures, do things to them, and think that will happen in the real world. Well, what is Canaanite religious practice like? The Israelites knew that our God was the God of history who brought us out of Egypt, but then they had the daily business of making the crops grow. How do you do it? You look at the people around you, and the Canaanites knew that in order to get the crops to grow, you knew that the male god of fertility and the female goddess of fertility had to interact. And so the ancient Canaanite farmer would dress up as the god of fertility, would go to the temple. The contribution plate would be passed at this point, would make a contribution, and would have a private session with the female goddess of fertility. And the Israelites looked at this, and some of them said, "Give me that old-time religion." The practice of cultic prostitution was meant as a way, and I will use a word here that is perfectly kosher to use, just doesn't sound that way. You had to get the god and the goddess to fructify the crops. And therefore, through the practice of sympathy. So when Hosea said that the people were whoring after other gods, it was not a metaphor. He meant it literally. Now, if I had extensive time and went on one of my well-known tangents here, I would go in a different direction, either to talk about how the typology that Hosea, the way he was told to use his life, becomes much more prominent in the New Testament. The use of typology of life becomes essential as a part of Christianity as I understand it. Or we could go in a different direction and look at the book of Ezekiel and say that at the first chapter of Ezekiel, where there's this weird thing and people thought he was on drugs and it had wheels and it had wings, and there was a face of a lion and the face of a man, and then later in Ezekiel where there's these bones and they're very dry, they've been there a long time, and God asks Ezekiel, can these bones live? And Ezekiel, being very clever, doesn't want to answer the question and wants to say God knows, but he's talking to God, so he can't say that, so he says, you know. Ataya Data, my favorite line in the whole Hebrew Bible, you know. God asks you a question, one expects the God of the entire universe to already know the answer. And then God says to Ezekiel, speak to these bones and prophesy to them, behold, these bones shall live, they shall have flesh upon flesh, and sinew upon sinew, and every single person who later on comes to believe in the notion of the resurrection of the body thinks that therefore the Hebrew Bible is talking about life after death, and it is not, because you have to remember that Ezekiel lived in exile in Babylonia, and he goes on to say, behold, these bones are the whole house of Israel. This is a national resurrection. It says the nation will live again. It's a metaphor. So how do you know if I'm saying that Hosea is not a metaphor, and Ezekiel primarily and fundamentally is talking in metaphor? How do you know what is and what isn't? Don't practice Bible at home. One has to study as part of a community and tease out the depth of its connection, both to history and how it plays out in our lives. But that's not where I'm going today. Today, I want to speak about the concept at the heart of Hosea's metaphor, the concept of love. Many years ago, I was a rabbi in exactly that part of Pennsylvania that will determine who our next national leader is. I was a rabbi in Erie, Pennsylvania. And I remember a meeting with one of our young people there, and we were discussing challenges to Jewish identity. The topic happens to be interfaith marriage. She was the product of interfaith marriage, and she didn't understand why it was an issue for anybody at all. I've since changed my own personal position on this, but nevertheless, it remains an issue for any group of how it interacts with other groups in society. And her reaction, though, stayed with me. She said, if God is love, then how can you... And this really threw me. It had never occurred to me before to say what she said. If God is love. Here's a kid raised in my religious school, raised at a synagogue, raised as a Jew, who's using what is essentially a formula from the surrounding culture that is essentially a Christian way of looking at the world. As a Jew, I didn't know what to do with that phrase, if God is love. As time went on, though, I realized that my reaction was far too strong, and part of my reaction was wrong. The most important prayer in Jewish life, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. Actually, the original words might have meant and Adonai alone. This might have originally been a loyalty oath and not the compelling, stirring affirmation of monotheism that we take it to mean today, but I don't like that interpretation, so I'm ignoring it. To me, the Shema has become an affirmation of the indivisible oneness of God. But the thing about this most important prayer in Jewish life is that, in fact, it is surrounded by love. Immediately before we begin these key words, we have the concept of love, and this is how it works for us. First, it is God's love for us. God so loved us that God gave us, don't finish that sentence. That God gave us the Torah. That's the Jewish view on how to finish that sentence. Law in Jewish life is love. It is an expression of love. Revelation is a gift. It is guidance. It is care. It is love. And then, after the opening words of this prayer, the Shema, Hear, O Israel, you shall love the eternal your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your veriness, with all your being. And then it goes on to say that what it means by that is following the Torah, following the concept of law. Law and love are reflections of each other. They are reflections of order. They are reflections of our highest aspiration and our deepest relationship. Through text and through teaching and through the lessons in our lives, the love we are taught begins with self, extends in a famous line that actually is in the Hebrew Bible, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. yourself. It extends then to the world and reaches out to God, to what is good, to all the godliness in the world. Love what is like you. Love what is not like you. Under all of it, with all of it, we discover that we are all a part of each other. And in this season of conventions and politics, without shouting out any slogans, but a reminder that love is what we are here